Story number 1. The Room with No Exit. Emma and her boyfriend, Jason, had been driving for hours along a highway that seemed to stretch endlessly through the fog-shrouded wilderness. Their destination, Jason's family cabin, was still miles away, but their GPS had long since failed, leaving them disoriented. The roads had grown narrow and isolated, with not a single other car in sight. The dense mist swallowed the road, reducing visibility to mere feet ahead. Tired and irritable, they were relieved when the vague outline of a building appeared through the fog. It was a motel, sitting alone at the edge of the highway, a forgotten relic of the past. The sign flickered Motel 66, its neon letters half burned out, casting an eerie, sputtering light over the cracked asphalt of the parking lot. Despite its dilapidated appearance, it was the only option for miles. Inside, the musty air and faded decor screamed of a time long gone. Behind the counter stood an old woman, her gray hair tied tightly in a bun, her thin lips stretched into a smile that didn't reach her cold, glassy eyes. She handed them a rusty key with the number 12 etched onto it. "Room 12, she croaked, her voice raspy with age. "Stay inside after dark. Don't open the door, no matter what you hear." Jason raised an eyebrow, amused. "Creepy advice for a creepy place," he whispered to Emma as they headed toward their room. Emma, though, felt a chill run down her spine. The woman's warning lingered in her mind as they settled into the room. It was small, dingy, and smelled of mildew, but they were too exhausted to care. The bed, though sagging, was a welcome sight. Night fell quickly, and with it came a silence so profound it pressed against their ears. The world outside seemed to disappear. Around midnight, just as they were drifting off, there was a sound of faint scratching, like claws on wood. Jason sat up, listening. Emma stirred beside him. The noise grew louder, a persistent scraping at the door. "Probably just a raccoon or something," Jason said, though his voice wavered. The scratching continued, joined by the unmistakable sound of whispering indistinct voices just beyond the door. Emma's heart raced. "Don't," she whispered, grabbing his arm as Jason got out of bed. "I am just going to check," he said. He walked to the door, ignoring her pleas. As soon as he turned the knob, the door creaked open by itself. The hallway beyond was empty, bathed in dim light. But the whispers didn't stop. They seemed to be coming from the far end of the corridor, distant but growing louder. Jason stepped out. "Jason, no, please," Emma begged, but he kept moving, disappearing down the hall. Minutes passed, then hours. Jason didn't return. Emma was frozen, terrified, waiting for any sign of him. But the whispers had stopped. The motel was silent once again. Minutes passed, then hours. Jason didn't return. Emma was frozen, terrified, waiting for any sign of him. But the whispers had stopped. The motel was silent once again. At dawn, Emma finally gathered the courage to venture out. The hallway was deserted. She searched every room, but there was no trace of Jason. Frantic, she ran back to their room, but when she opened the door, her blood ran cold. The room was empty except for Jason's jacket, now draped over the bed covered in fresh blood. The old woman at the front desk was nowhere to be found. Emma ran outside, but the motel was gone. There was nothing but an endless stretch of fog-covered road behind her, and she was alone. Minutes passed, then hours. Jason didn't return. Emma was frozen, terrified, waiting for any sign of him. But the whispers had stopped. The motel was silent once again. Story number 2. The Vanishing Guests. Motel 66 was the kind of place no one talked about, though its flickering neon sign stood out like a beacon in the middle of nowhere. Situated along a forgotten stretch of highway, it catered to a particular type of traveler, the kind who didn't ask too many questions, who needed a place to crash for the night and then be on their way. But many of those travelers were never heard from again. Tom and Sarah were one such pair. They had been on the road for days, exploring back roads in search of adventure. But when the storm hit, they found themselves far from any town, with rain lashing at the windows and the road ahead obscured by sheets of water. The Motel's sign appeared out of the storm like an answer to their prayers. They pulled into the parking lot, waterlogged and weary, deciding to spend the night. Inside, the motel was eerily quiet. The receptionist, a tall man with a thin, unsettling smile, stood behind the desk. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes seemed too bright, too alert for such a late hour. He spoke in a soft, almost whispery voice. "Room 7, he said, sliding a tarnished brass key across the counter. "You'll be safe there." As Tom and Sarah made their way down the dimly lit hall, the rain hammered against the roof like a drumbeat, setting the scene for the strangeness that would follow. That night, as they tried to sleep, strange sounds echoed from the walls, murmurs that seemed to come from the air vents, like distant conversations. Sarah, half asleep, thought she heard her name whispered. The sound was so close, as if someone were standing right next to the bed. She shot upright, waking Tom. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Hear what?" Tom mumbled, still groggy. "The whispering," Sarah said. "Someone's outside." Tom sighed, annoyed but slightly unnerved. He got up and checked the hallway. Empty. He even opened the vent in their room, finding nothing but darkness beyond. He crawled back into bed, muttering something about Sarah's overactive imagination. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The next morning, the storm had passed, but the motel was eerily still. The receptionist was gone. No sign of him, and no other guests either. When they tried to check out, no one answered the bell at the front desk. They waited for a while before deciding to just leave. But when they stepped outside, the world had changed. The road they had driven in on was gone. Instead of asphalt stretching out in either direction, there was only a barren wasteland, as if the motel were floating in the middle of some vast, desolate plain. The trees, the highway, everything was gone. Panicked, Tom ran back inside, dragging Sarah with him. But the motel now seemed different. The hallways stretched longer than before, and the doors to the other rooms were gone, replaced by solid walls. There was no exit. They were trapped in a motel that didn't want them to leave. As the day dragged on, their sense of time became hazy. Hours passed, or perhaps only minutes. It was impossible to tell. They tried to break windows, tear open walls, but the motel was impenetrable. They screamed, pleaded for help, but no one answered. Eventually, they gave in to the surreal horror of their situation. They would never leave. They had become like the others, those who had checked into the Black Ridge Motel, only to vanish without a trace. Story number 3. The Motel That Moves. Mark Phillips had spent over a decade on the road, navigating America's highways as a traveling salesman. He prided himself on his flawless sense of direction, having memorized countless routes, rest stops, and motels. But tonight was different. It had been hours since he'd seen a familiar landmark, and the narrow road winding through dense, unfamiliar forest didn't show up on any map. His GPS blinked uselessly, showing only static, and the radio emitted nothing but faint, crackling white noise. The sky outside was pitch black, the only light coming from his car's weak headlights, which barely illuminated the trees that seemed too close in around him. The road felt endless, and as the minutes dragged on, a heavy sense of unease began to creep over him. He was completely alone, and there was something wrong with this place. He could feel it. Just as his anxiety hit its peak, a neon light flickered ahead, piercing the darkness. It blinked erratically, casting a faint glow through the mist that clung to the ground. As he got closer, he saw the sign, Motel 66. The neon tubes buzzing faintly, struggling to stay lit. He slowed the car to a crawl, staring at the old, run-down building. Mark was sure of one thing: this motel hadn't been here before. He had driven this route countless times over the years, and there had never been a motel on this stretch of road. And yet, here it was, sitting in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by an eerie, unnatural silence. For a moment, he considered driving on, but exhaustion weighed heavily on him. His eyes burned from staring into the dark for so long, and the thought of continuing down the desolate road seemed unbearable. He pulled into the cracked parking lot, his tires crunching over gravel and weeds that had grown through the asphalt. There were no other cars, no signs of life. Mark parked, grabbed his overnight bag, and made his way to the front entrance. The lobby door creaked loudly as he pushed it open, and the smell of stale air and dust hit him immediately. The place looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. A bell dinged softly above the door, but the reception desk stood empty. He glanced around worn chairs, faded wallpaper, and a grandfather clock that had stopped ticking long ago. After a minute or two of waiting, a young man appeared from a back room. His appearance was strange, out of time. He wore a crisp, outdated uniform, the kind you'd expect from a 1950s bellhop. His hair was slicked back, and his eyes were unnervingly wide and bright, as if he were just a little too eager to see Mark. "Welcome, sir," the man said, his voice soft, polite, but with an undertone of something that made Mark's skin crawl. "We don't get many visitors this time of night. Room for one." Mark hesitated, but exhaustion and the weight of the night's strange journey convinced him to stay. "Yeah, just for the night," he replied, glancing at the dusty counter. The young man's eyes didn't seem to blink. "Room 6, the man said, handing Mark an old-fashioned brass key. The key felt cold and heavy in Mark's hand. "Enjoy your stay." Mark mumbled a quick thanks and headed down the dimly lit hallway. The wallpaper was faded, peeling at the edges, and the carpeting was so worn that it was hard to tell what color it had originally been. The air was thick with dust, and the entire place had an unsettling, timeless quality, like a forgotten relic stuck in another era. Room 6 was small, just a bed, a nightstand, and a creaky old chair by the window. The bedspread was a garish floral print, stained and faded, and the window looked out onto nothing but thick, impenetrable fog. Mark tried to brush off the feeling of unease that had settled in his chest. It was just an old, run-down motel, nothing more. He tossed his bag on the chair and lay down, hoping sleep would come quickly. But the moment his eyes closed, something felt wrong. The air in the room felt thick, suffocating. It was cold, but not in a normal way, more like the cold of something unnatural. He tried to ignore it, pulling the blanket tighter around himself. His mind raced with the oddities of the day, the road that hadn't appeared on any map, the strange neon sign, the bellhop as to bright eyes. A loud creak snapped him out of his thoughts. Mark's eyes shot open, and he froze. The door to his room, which he had locked, was wide open. A cold draft blew in from the hallway, chilling him to the bone. He sat up slowly, heart pounding, trying to understand what was happening. Had someone come in? Was this some sort of trick? He stepped cautiously toward the door and peered out into the hallway. It was empty, but the silence felt oppressive. He stepped out of his room and looked down the long, narrow corridor. That's when he noticed something was different. The hallway seemed to stretch farther than before, much longer than it had been when he first walked in. The lights flickered faintly, casting strange shadows that danced along the walls. Mark felt a sinking dread in his stomach. Something was very wrong with this place. He turned back to his room, intending to shut the door and wait out the night. But to his horror, the door was gone. Where the entrance to room 6 had once been, there was now only solid wall, as if the door had never existed. Panic surged through him. He hurried down the hallway, hoping to find another exit, but the corridor seemed to warp and twist with every step he took. The walls felt closer, the air colder. He passed door after door, but none of them had handles. They were sealed shut, mocking him with their blank, featureless surfaces. Suddenly, the hallway split into two, neither direction familiar. Mark's breath quickened as he turned left, only to find that the path looped back on itself, leading him deeper into the motel. His heart raced, his footsteps echoed louder in the empty space, and he could no longer tell how much time had passed. Then he heard a soft humming, coming from somewhere down the hall. It was a tune he vaguely recognized, something old and haunting. He followed the sound, desperate for any sign of life, any explanation for what was happening. As he rounded a corner, the humming grew louder, more distinct. And there, standing in the middle of the hall, was the bellhop. The young man smiled that same unsettling smile, but this time it seemed far more menacing. "Lost, sir?" he asked, his voice dripping with mock concern. Mark backed away slowly, his mind racing. "What is this place? What's happening?" he demanded, though his voice trembled. The bellhop's grin widened, and for the first time, Mark noticed something else in his eyes, something ancient, predatory. "This place, it's not meant to be found. You shouldn't have come here." Mark turned and ran, his footsteps pounding against the floor. The hallway seemed to stretch forever, shifting and bending as if the motel itself were alive, rearranging itself to trap him. The walls warped, narrowing until they closed in on him like a vice, the air growing thicker and harder to breathe. He stumbled, falling to his knees in the middle of the endless corridor. His lungs burned, his mind clouded with fear. The humming grew louder, closer, and the shadows began to move, twisting into grotesque shapes that reached for him. When Mark looked up, the bellhop was standing over him, his eyes glowing with a cold, otherworldly light. "You can't leave, Mr. Phillips," he whispered, his voice echoing through the suffocating air. "This is the last stop." And then, everything went black. Mark Phillips was never seen again. Motel 66 remains a legend among travelers, a place that appears to the lost and weary, then vanishes without a trace, taking its guests with it. Some say it still moves from one forgotten road to another, waiting for its next visitor. Those who check in, it seems, never check out. End of the story.